15 years. 15 years of Sundays in the garage. 15 years listening to Gerald's soft humming while he cleaned metal parts with an old toothbrush. 15 years watching his hands, increasingly marked by age, caress every screw, every wire, every inch of that '67 Mustang as if it were a living being. The empty garage hit me like a physical slap. I stood frozen in the doorway, grocery bags still hanging from my hands, unable to process what my eyes were seeing. The space that for years had been Gerald's sanctuary, and after his death my last refuge to feel him close, was now just bare cement and discolored walls where tools once hung. Andrew? My voice sounded strange, too high-pitched, as I dropped the bags and walked to the center of the empty garage. Andrew! I found my son in the kitchen, reviewing papers with the nonchalance of someone organizing weekly shopping receipts, not someone who had erased the last tangible vestige of his father. "Where is your father's car?" I asked, my hands trembling. Andrew barely looked up from his documents. At 45, he resembled Gerald so much physically and so little in spirit that it sometimes hurt to look at him. "Sold it this morning," he replied, as if commenting on the weather. "A collector bought it for a good price." "You sold it?" The words caught in my throat. "How could you? It was your father's." Andrew shrugged, a casual gesture that ignited something primitive inside me. "Wendy wanted to turn the garage into a closet," he explained, returning to his papers. "She needed space for her seasonal clothes. Besides, Mom, that car was just collecting dust. You don't even know how to drive it." Wendy. Of course. My daughter-in-law, the interior designer who saw our modest home as a renovation project, not as the home where Gerald and I had built a life for nearly 5 decades. "That car was everything to your father," I said, struggling to maintain my composure. "He dedicated the last years of his life to restoring it. It was an object, Mom." Andrew finally looked at me with that condescending expression he had perfected since adolescence. "Dad is gone. The car won't bring him back. I'm his legal heir, and I made a sensible financial decision." 71 years of life hadn't prepared me for this moment. To discover that my own son didn't understand that the Mustang wasn't just metal and gasoline. It was every Sunday Gerald spent working on it while fighting cancer. It was the determination to finish one last project before his body surrendered. It was the only place where I could still sit and breathe his scent, oil, metal, and that aftershave he used for 40 years. But I couldn't find the words to explain all this to Andrew. We had never spoken the same language, my son and I. Gerald had been our translator, the bridge between my emotional warmth and Andrew's cold practicality. "You could have at least consulted me," was all I could say. "It would have been an unnecessarily emotional conversation," Andrew replied, signing the final document. "Wendy and I thought it would be easier for you this way, like ripping off a bandage." I left the kitchen before saying something unforgivable. I returned to the empty garage, feeling a sort of vertigo as I contemplated the stripped space. At that moment, with the mid-afternoon light filtering through the single window, I felt more widowed than ever, as if I had lost Gerald a second time. I don't know how long I stood there on the cold cement when the house phone rang. I let it ring, then it rang again and again. Finally, I heard Andrew's voice answering. Seconds later, he appeared in the garage doorway with an odd expression. "It's for you," he said, extending the cordless phone. "Someone named Carlos, from Premium Classics. The shop that bought the Mustang." I took the phone with distrust. "Hello? Mrs. Thompson? This is Carlos Mendoza from Premium Classics." The voice on the other end sounded respectful, almost reverent. "Your husband left something inside the Mustang's seat. You need to come right away." "My husband?" I repeated, confused. "My husband passed away 3 years ago." "I know, ma'am," Carlos replied, "and I'm very sorry. Gerald was a true craftsman. But this is important. We found a hidden compartment under the driver's seat. There's a box with your name on it. Please come as soon as possible." I looked at Andrew, who had heard enough to finally show a glimmer of curiosity. "I'll be right there," I answered, feeling something like hope for the first time in hours. The journey to the shop was silent. Andrew insisted on driving me, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of curiosity. We didn't speak. I stared out the window, wondering what Gerald might have left in that secret compartment. A forgotten tool? Some document? When we arrived at Premium Classics, the Mustang gleamed under the shop lights, more beautiful than ever. My heart contracted at the sight, knowing it was no longer mine, no longer ours. Carlos Mendoza turned out to be a middle-aged man with calloused hands and kind eyes. He greeted me with a respect that painfully contrasted with my own son's indifference. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, shaking my hand. "It's an honor to meet you. Your husband spoke often about you." "You knew Gerald?" I asked, surprised. Carlos smiled. "We were friends. We shared a passion for classics," he explained, guiding me toward the Mustang. "When we found this, I immediately knew I had to call you." He leaned into the car and removed the driver's seat with surprising ease, revealing a perfectly constructed compartment in the base. From it, he extracted a wooden box, hand-carved with delicate floral motifs. "This is your box, ma'am," said Carlos, carefully handing it to me. "Gerald told me that someday it would find its way to you. It seems today is that day." I took the box, feeling its solid weight, recognizing the carved flowers as my favorites, daisies and lilies, and the meticulous work of Gerald's hands. And in that moment, as I held that box in a dealership that smelled of new tires and industrial air freshener, I felt my husband's presence closer than in the 3 years since his departure. As if somehow he had foreseen this moment and had prepared one last message for me. "There's something else," added Carlos, glancing briefly at Andrew, who was watching the scene with an indecipherable expression. "But I think you should see it in private after opening the box." "Something else?" I echoed, clutching the wooden box against my chest. Carlos nodded, his expression warm but guarded. "If you'd like to follow me to my office, Mrs. Thompson, it's more private." I glanced at Andrew, who was examining the Mustang with newfound interest, as if seeing it properly for the first time. "I'll wait here," he said, not meeting my eyes. Perhaps guilt was finally beginning to penetrate his pragmatic shell. Carlos led me through a door marked private into a small office cluttered with automotive magazines, vintage advertisement posters, and framed photographs of classic cars. He pulled out a chair for me, then seated himself behind the desk. "Your husband and I met at a car show about 10 years ago," he explained, folding his weathered hands on the desktop. "We bonded over our love for American classics. When his health began to decline, he approached me with an unusual request." My fingers traced the carved flowers on the box in my lap. "Lilies and daisies," Gerald had remembered. After 47 years of marriage, he still remembered which flowers I'd carried on our wedding day. "What kind of request?" I asked. Carlos reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small envelope. "Gerald asked me to keep something safe for you. He said that if the day ever came when the Mustang was sold, and he was quite certain that day would come, I was to give you this, along with the box he concealed in the car." He handed me the envelope. My name was written on the front in Gerald's distinctive handwriting, slightly slanted to the right, with an elegant curl to the capital M in Margaret. Just seeing those familiar pen strokes brought a lump to my throat. "I'll give you some privacy," Carlos said gently, rising from his chair. "Take all the time you need." When the door closed behind him, I sat motionless for several moments, staring at the envelope and the box. These final pieces of Gerald, unexpected gifts from beyond the grave, felt almost too precious to open, as if breaking the seal would somehow be the true end of our story. Finally, I carefully opened the envelope, unfolding a single sheet of paper covered in Gerald's handwriting. "My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, 2 things have happened. I've left this world, and Andrew has sold the Mustang. I'm not angry about either. Death comes to us all, and Andrew has never shared our appreciation for things with soul and history. The box contains my journey with the Mustang, photos, notes, and thoughts I had while working on it. But more importantly, it contains something for your journey forward. I know you're angry right now, hurt that our son could discard something that meant so much to me, to us. But please remember that Andrew experiences the world differently than we do. He sees function, not meaning. Efficiency, not soul. It's not a flaw in his character. It's simply who he is. Now, about the something else Carlos mentioned. Please step back out to the showroom when you're ready. Your real surprise awaits there. It's the true reason I'm at peace with the Mustang finding a new home. Remember how we always talked about taking that cross-country drive? How you said someday we would see the Grand Canyon at sunset and the redwoods at dawn? Someday has arrived, my love. It's your turn to be brave. Forever yours, Gerald. I pressed the letter to my heart, tears flowing freely now. Even from beyond the grave, Gerald knew exactly what I was feeling. How had he known with such certainty that Andrew would sell the car? And what surprise could possibly ease the pain of losing this last tangible piece of him? With trembling hands, I finally opened the wooden box. Inside, just as Gerald's letter had promised, lay a meticulously organized collection. A leather-bound journal filled with detailed notes about every aspect of the Mustang's restoration. Photographs documenting the process from the day he'd brought home the rusted shell to the gleaming finished product. Small sketches of parts he'd fabricated himself when originals couldn't be found. But beneath these, in a separate compartment, I discovered financial documents, investment statements, bank accounts, and legal papers, all in my name. Gerald had been quietly investing for years, building a substantial nest egg that I'd known nothing about. A note paper clipped to these documents read simply, "For your adventures, my love. No more someday." After composing myself as best I could, I gathered the box and letter and stepped back into the showroom. Andrew was still examining the Mustang, running his hand along its polished hood with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Carlos stood near the main counter, talking quietly with a younger man. When he saw me, he smiled and gestured for me to join them. "Mrs. Thompson, are you ready for the second part of Gerald's surprise?" I nodded, unable to form words around the emotion clogging my throat. "Follow me," he said, leading me toward a door at the back of the showroom. Andrew trailed behind us, curiosity apparently overcoming his earlier detachment. The door opened onto a smaller showroom space, brightly lit and containing just one vehicle, a sleek silver Audi A3 with a large red bow on the hood. "This," Carlos announced with evident satisfaction, "is yours, Mrs. Thompson. Fully paid for by Gerald 3 years ago, with instructions to keep it safely stored until the day the Mustang was sold." I stared at the car in disbelief. It was beautiful, modern, and nothing like the massive classic cars Gerald had loved. "I don't understand," I whispered. Carlos handed me a key fob. "Gerald said you needed something automatic, easy to drive, with all the modern safety features, something to give you confidence on the road." He smiled gently. He said, and I quote, "Margaret has spent her whole life being cautious. It's time she had an adventure." Andrew stepped forward, his expression a mixture of shock and something that might have been respect. "Dad bought you a car? But you don't even drive." "I have my license," I replied quietly. "I just haven't driven in years. Not since the interstate frightened me that time we were coming back from your college graduation." Carlos opened the driver's door. "There's one more thing inside," he said. On the passenger seat lay a large envelope and a brand new GPS device. I opened the envelope to find a meticulously planned road trip itinerary with maps, hotel reservations, and highlighted attractions forming a grand loop across the country. All the places Gerald and I had talked about visiting someday. At the top of the first page, in Gerald's handwriting, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single turn of the key. "Be brave, my Margaret." For the first time that day, I felt something beyond grief and anger, a tiny spark of possibility. "He planned all this?" Andrew asked, peering over my shoulder at the maps. "Your father," I said softly, running my fingers over the leather steering wheel, "always thought of everything." "Would you like to sit in it?" Carlos asked, gesturing to the driver's seat. I hesitated, feeling suddenly like a teenager offered her first taste of independence. The Audi gleamed under the showroom lights, sophisticated and somewhat intimidating with its modern dashboard full of buttons and screens I didn't recognize. I began, then stopped, Gerald's words echoing in my mind. "Be brave, my Margaret." With a deep breath, I stepped forward and carefully lowered myself into the driver's seat. The leather was supple and comfortable, adjusting to my form as if custom-made for my body. The steering wheel felt smooth beneath my fingers, and the dashboard, though initially intimidating, seemed intuitively arranged. Everything was within easy reach. "Gerald specifically chose this model," Carlos explained, leaning down to point out features. "Automatic transmission, of course. Excellent safety ratings. The backup camera shows you everything behind you on this screen, and the navigation system is pre-programmed with the entire route he planned for you." Andrew circled the car, his expression unreadable. "This is a significant purchase," he said, reverting to his business tone. "High-end, late model. What kind of condition is the engine in after sitting for 3 years?" "Perfect condition," Carlos replied with professional pride. "We've maintained it monthly, Oil changes, battery maintenance, even drove it around the block regularly to keep everything in working order. Gerald paid for a comprehensive service contract. Of course he did, Andrew muttered. But there was something new in his voice. Not quite admiration, but perhaps a dawning realization of the depths of his father's planning. I ran my hands over the steering wheel, trying to process the reality of this gift. For decades, I'd been the passenger in our marriage, not because Gerald dominated, but because I preferred it that way. He'd always been the adventurer, the risk-taker, while I provided the stable foundation from which he could explore. The thought of reversing those roles was both terrifying and, strangely, exhilarating. "There's a driving instructor's card in the glove compartment," Carlos continued. "Gerald arranged for refresher lessons, specialized for mature drivers. The first 10 sessions are already paid for." I opened the glove compartment and found not just the instructor's card, but a small leather-bound notebook with road trip journal embossed on the cover. Inside, the first page contained another note from Gerald. "Record what you see, my love. The world looks different from the driver's seat." "I don't know what to say," I whispered, closing the journal and clutching it against my chest. "Say you'll drive it," came Andrew's unexpected response. I looked up to find my son watching me with an expression I hadn't seen since he was a child, a mixture of uncertainty and hope. "Dad obviously wanted this for you." "I don't know if I can," I admitted. "It's been years since I've driven anywhere beyond the grocery store, and even that was in our old station wagon." "That's why he arranged for the lessons," Carlos said gently. "Gerald told me you were always braver than you gave yourself credit for." I wasn't so sure about that. The thought of merging onto highways, navigating unfamiliar cities, making decisions behind the wheel, it all seemed overwhelming. But then again, I'd never imagined I could survive losing Gerald either. And somehow, I'd managed 3 years without him. "Could I try it? Just around the block?" I asked tentatively. Carlos beamed. "Absolutely. Let me grab the temporary registration papers and we can take it for a spin right now." While Carlos gathered the necessary documents, I familiarized myself with the car's interior, adjusting the seat and mirrors to my height. Andrew stood awkwardly by the passenger door. "Would you like to come along?" I asked him, surprised by my own invitation. He hesitated, checking his watch, a habit so reminiscent of his father that my heart clenched. But unlike Gerald, who checked the time to savor each moment, Andrew always seemed to be calculating how quickly he could move to the next task. "I should call Wendy," he said. "Let her know we'll be delayed." "Of course," I tried to keep the disappointment from my voice. To my surprise, after a brief conversation with his wife, Andrew opened the passenger door and settled in beside me. "She says to take our time," he explained, though his expression suggested the conversation hadn't been quite that simple. Carlos returned with the paperwork and a temporary license plate. "Everything's in order. The car is officially yours, Mrs. Thompson." He handed me a folder of documents. "Registration, insurance, all current and in your name." Gerald thought of everything. "He always did," I whispered. With Carlos's encouragement, I pressed the push-button start. The engine came to life with a gentle purr, nothing like the throaty roar of Gerald's Mustang, but reassuring in its quiet efficiency. The dashboard illuminated, and the navigation screen displayed a cheerful, "Welcome, Margaret." "He even programmed your name into it," Andrew observed, something like genuine amazement in his voice. Following Carlos's patient instructions, I put the car in drive and carefully pulled out of the showroom and into the afternoon sunlight. The steering was responsive, but forgiving, the brakes smooth and predictable. As we circled the block, I felt a strange sensation building in my chest. Not quite confidence yet, but perhaps its precursor, possibility. "You're doing great, Mom," Andrew said, as I successfully navigated a turn. The simple encouragement, so rare from my perpetually critical son, nearly brought tears to my eyes. When we returned to the dealership, Carlos was waiting with an approving smile. "How did it feel?" I searched for the right words. "Like Gerald is still teaching me new things." That's exactly what he hoped for. Carlos helped me from the car. "The driving instructor can start tomorrow if you'd like." Gerald suggested beginning with quiet neighborhood streets and gradually working up to highways. I nodded, overwhelmed by both gratitude and trepidation. The reality of what Gerald had set in motion was sinking in. This wasn't just a car. It was an invitation to a completely different life than the one I'd grown comfortable with. A life of self-reliance and adventure rather than routine and safety. On the drive home, with Andrew behind the wheel of his SUV and me following in my new Audi. I caught glimpses of myself in the rearview mirror. I looked different somehow. Still a 71-year-old widow with silver hair and lines etched by both laughter and grief. But there was something new in my eyes, a spark that had been dormant for too long. At home, I parked carefully in the empty garage. The space that had housed Gerald's passion project for 15 years now contained mine. The symmetry wasn't lost on me. Andrew lingered in the driveway, uncharacteristic hesitation in his posture. "Mom, about selling the Mustang without telling you. I should have." "Your father knew you would sell it," I interrupted gently. "He wasn't angry, and neither am I. Not anymore." "How could he have known?" I smiled, thinking of how well Gerald had understood our son, far better than I ever had. "Your father saw people clearly. He knew you didn't attach the same meaning to objects that we did." Andrew frowned slightly. "That car was worth a lot of money. I thought I was making a smart financial decision for the family." "I know," I said, and for the first time, I truly did understand my son's perspective. Not agree with it, perhaps, but understand it. But some things have value beyond their price tag. I looked at the Audi, gleaming in the late afternoon light. Your father's last gift wasn't just a car. It was permission to be brave. The driving instructor's name was Eleanor Hart, a retired high school teacher with a shock of white hair, piercing blue eyes, and the reassuring confidence of someone who had taught thousands of nervous people to drive. She arrived at my door precisely at 9 the following morning, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm and a travel mug of coffee in hand. "Mrs. Thompson?" She extended her hand with a firm grip. "I'm Ellie. Your husband arranged for my services about 3 years ago. I've been expecting your call." "You knew Gerald?" I asked, inviting her inside. "We met when he came to inquire about lessons specialized for mature drivers," she explained, settling at my kitchen table. "He was quite specific about what you would need: patience, encouragement, and absolutely no condescension." She smiled. "He described you as cautious but more capable than she realizes." Hearing Gerald's assessment of me from this stranger's lips brought a fresh wave of emotion. Even as cancer was stealing his future, he had been planning for mine with such thoughtfulness. "I'm not sure he was right about the capable part," I admitted. "It's been nearly 20 years since I drove regularly." "Well, that's why I'm here," Eleanor replied pragmatically. "Driving is like riding a bicycle. The basic skills remain, but your confidence needs rebuilding." She opened her portfolio, revealing a customized curriculum. "Gerald and I designed this program specifically for you. We'll start with the fundamentals in quiet neighborhoods, then progressively challenge you with busier streets, highways, and eventually interstate driving." I stared at the detailed lesson plan, each session carefully structured to build on the previous one. "He really thought of everything. He believed in you," Eleanor said simply. "Now, shall we begin with your new vehicle?" For the next 2 hours, we sat in my parked Audi while Eleanor patiently reacquainted me with driving fundamentals, mirror positioning, blind spot awareness, modern safety features that hadn't existed when I last drove regularly. She explained each button and setting on the sophisticated dashboard until they began to make sense. "You're a quick study," she observed, as I correctly identified each control. "I taught 3rd grade for 35 years, I explained. "I know how to follow instructions. Teaching requires intelligence and adaptability, both excellent qualities for driving," Eleanor remarked. "Now let's take this beautiful machine around the block." My hands trembled slightly as I pressed the start button. Despite yesterday's brief drive from the dealership, I felt a rush of anxiety. Eleanor seemed to notice. "Margaret," she said gently, "driving is about managing fear, not eliminating it. Even experienced drivers feel occasional anxiety. The difference is, they've learned to drive alongside it rather than letting it paralyze them." It was exactly the kind of practical wisdom Gerald would have appreciated. I nodded, put the car in drive, and cautiously pulled away from the curb. We spent another hour navigating the quiet streets of my neighborhood, Eleanor calmly guiding me through turns, stops, and basic maneuvers. By noon, I had successfully completed a dozen blocks without incident. "Excellent progress for day 1, she declared as we returned to my driveway. "Tomorrow we'll venture a bit further, perhaps to the shopping center a few miles away." After Eleanor left, I sat in the silent car for several minutes, absorbing the morning's achievements. Small steps, certainly, but steps nonetheless. I wondered what Gerald would think of my progress. if he would be proud or amused by my cautious approach to this adventure he'd orchestrated. As if in answer, my phone rang. It was Andrew. "Mom, how were the driving lessons?" His tone held uncharacteristic interest. "They went well," I replied, surprised by his call. Andrew rarely checked in unless there was something specific he needed. "My instructor is excellent." Good. He paused awkwardly. "Look, I've been thinking about everything. The Mustang, Dad's plans for you. I was wondering if I could come by this evening. There's something I'd like to discuss." Curiosity piqued, I agreed. After hanging up, I found myself in the garage again, looking at the Audi in the space where the Mustang had stood for so many years. The absence still ached, but differently now, less like an amputation, and more like the bittersweet transition of seasons. I opened the wooden box Carlos had given me, running my fingers over Gerald's meticulous notes about the Mustang's restoration. Each page documented not just mechanical details, but his thoughts and feelings throughout the process. One entry, dated about 6 months before his death, caught my eye. "Doctor says the treatment isn't working as hoped. Told Margaret it's going better than expected. Don't want her to worry more than necessary. Need to finish this car. Need to finalize Margaret's arrangements. She's always been afraid of change, my sweet, cautious wife, but she's stronger than she knows. The Mustang is my legacy to the world, a beautiful machine brought back to life through patience and care. But Margaret is my legacy to herself, a beautiful soul who needs to discover her own strength. If I've done my job right, selling the Mustang will be the key that starts her engine." I closed the journal, tears blurring my vision. Gerald had known he was dying while writing these words, yet his concern had been for me, for the life I would lead without him. Andrew arrived promptly at 6, carrying a manila folder and looking uncharacteristically nervous. After declining my offer of dinner, he sat at the kitchen table, the folder placed precisely before him. "Mom, I need to show you something," he began, opening the folder to reveal photographs, dozens of images of the Mustang from various angles, professionally shot under perfect lighting. "I had these taken before the sale," he explained. I thought you might want them." I looked up, startled by this unexpected gesture of understanding. "That's very thoughtful, Andrew," I said, carefully examining the beautiful photographs that captured every detail of Gerald's masterpiece. "There's more," he continued, his voice hesitant. "The buyer, he's a collector who specializes in painstakingly restored classics. When Carlos explained the story behind the car, how Dad spent his final years bringing it back to life," Andrew paused, seemingly struggling with uncharacteristic emotion. "The buyer has offered visitation rights." "Visitation rights?" I echoed. "He keeps his collection in a climate-controlled showroom about 30 miles from here. He says you're welcome to visit the Mustang anytime you want." Andrew slid a business card across the table. "His name is Richard Bennett. I've already spoken with him. He's a decent man who genuinely appreciates what Dad accomplished with that car." I stared at the card, processing this unexpected development. "Why would you arrange this?" Andrew looked down, fiddling with the edge of the folder in a gesture so unlike his usual confident demeanor. "Because I'm beginning to understand that I made a mistake. Not legally. As Dad's heir, I had every right to sell the car." He looked up, meeting my eyes directly. "But I failed to consider what it meant to you, what it represented. Your father knew you would sell it," I said gently. "He planned for it." "Yes, but he also knew I would do it thoughtlessly," Andrew replied with surprising self-awareness. "He knew I would see an asset, not a legacy." He gestured to the photographs. "I'm trying to do better, Mom. To see things more like he did." The admission, so difficult for my pragmatic, emotionally reserved son, moved me deeply. It was the most vulnerable I'd seen Andrew since he was a child, coming to terms with a disappointing baseball game. "Your father would be proud of you for this," I told him, covering his hand with mine. Andrew cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional territory. "There's one more thing. I spoke with your driving instructor today. She thinks you're making excellent progress." I raised my eyebrows, surprised. "You called Eleanor?" He nodded. "I wanted to make sure Dad's plan was being properly executed." The businessman in him couldn't help emerging, even in this moment of connection. "She mentioned that your ultimate goal is to take a cross-country trip? That's what your father planned," I confirmed. "Though I'm not sure I'll ever be ready for something that ambitious." For the first time in years, I saw a genuine smile spread across my son's face. "When you are," he said, "I'd like to go with you. For part of it, at least. I think Dad would have wanted that." As evening settled around us, I realized Gerald's final gift wasn't just the Audi, or even the road trip he'd planned. It was this moment of genuine connection with our son, something I'd almost given up hope of experiencing again. 3 weeks into my driving lessons with Eleanor, we faced our biggest challenge yet, the interstate. I'd been dreading this milestone since we began, my stomach knotting at the mere thought of merging into fast-moving traffic, navigating multiple lanes, and maintaining highway speeds. "Remember," Eleanor said as we approached the on-ramp, "the interstate is actually safer than city driving in many ways. Fewer intersections, no traffic lights, predictable flow." Her calm logic did little to quiet my racing heart as I signaled and began accelerating down the entrance ramp. The speedometer climbed, 40, 50, 55, while I anxiously checked my mirrors for an opening in the steady stream of cars to our left. "Good acceleration," Eleanor encouraged. "Now look for your gap. There, between the blue sedan and the white van. Signal and move smoothly when you reach proper speed." I followed her instructions, my knuckles white on the steering wheel as I guided the Audi into the right lane of Interstate 95. The sensation of being surrounded by vehicles all moving at high speed was simultaneously terrifying and oddly exhilarating. "Excellent merge," Eleanor exclaimed. "Now maintain your lane position and speed. We'll exit in 5 miles. Those 5 miles became a meditation in controlled breathing and focused attention. With each passing minute, my death grip on the steering wheel loosened slightly. By the time we took our exit, I realized I'd been so concentrated on the task that I'd forgotten to be afraid. "How do you feel?" Eleanor asked as we pulled into a rest area. "Like I've climbed Mount Everest," I admitted, surprised to find my hands steady as I put the car in park. "In a way, you have," she replied, with a knowing smile. "Fear of highway driving is one of the most common obstacles for returning drivers. You've just conquered a significant mental barrier." On the drive home, taking local roads rather than challenging the interstate again so soon, I found myself thinking about Gerald's restoration of the Mustang. He'd approached that daunting project one small piece at a time, never overwhelmed by the entirety of the task. Perhaps this journey he'd planned for me required the same approach, mile by mile, challenge by challenge, gradually rebuilding my confidence as he had rebuilt that car. The following day brought an unexpected visitor. I was reviewing the road trip itinerary Gerald had created when the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Carlos Mendoza standing on my porch, holding a small package. "Mrs. Thompson," he greeted me warmly. "I hope I'm not intruding. I found something else of Gerald's that I thought you should have." I invited him in, curious about this new development. In my living room, Carlos carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a small model car, a perfect miniature replica of Gerald's Mustang, detailed down to the custom paint job and chrome trim. "Gerald commissioned this from a model maker friend of mine," Carlos explained. "He wanted you to have something to remember the real car by, something that could sit on a shelf and remind you of his work without taking up an entire garage." I cradled the model in my palms, marveling at the craftsmanship. Every detail was perfect. Even the tiny license plate matched the one Gerald had chosen for the original. "It's beautiful," I whispered. "When did he arrange this?" "About a month before he passed," Carlos replied gently. "He was very specific about the details. My friend only finished it recently, which is why I didn't have it to give you at the dealership." I placed the model carefully on my mantelpiece, where it seemed to immediately belong, a small but perfect representation of Gerald's passion and care. "Eleanor tells me you're making excellent progress with your driving," Carlos commented. I turned to him surprised. "You know Eleanor?" He nodded. "Gerald introduced us when he was setting up your safety net, I suppose you could call it. He wanted to make sure there were people who understood his plans for you, people who could offer support when the time came." The revelation that Gerald had created not just a car and an itinerary, but an entire network of supportive individuals to guide me forward was overwhelming. While I'd been focused on his illness, on making his final months comfortable, he had been quietly orchestrating this elaborate path for my future. "I tackled the interstate yesterday," I told Carlos, feeling a strange pride in the accomplishment. "That's fantastic." His enthusiasm seemed genuine. "Highway driving is a major milestone. How did it feel?" "Terrifying," I admitted. "Then empowering. Then just driving." Carlos nodded knowingly. That's often how it goes with the things that frighten us most. First, they seem impossible. Then they become achievements. And finally, they're just part of life. After Carlos left, I found myself drawn to Gerald's road trip itinerary again. I spread the maps across the kitchen table, tracing the carefully plotted route with my fingertip. Starting from our home in Connecticut, the journey looped westward through Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Illinois, before turning south through Missouri and Oklahoma, then west again through New Mexico and Arizona, up the California coast, and back east through the northern states. Each stop was meticulously planned, not just hotels and distances, but notes about special sites, restaurants Gerald thought I'd enjoy, and even the best times of day to view certain landmarks. Grand Canyon at sunset, read one note. The light on the red rocks is something everyone should see once. Had he visited these places himself? Some, perhaps, during business trips over the years, but most, I suspected, he'd researched specifically for this itinerary, places he'd hoped we might see together someday before cancer rewrote our plans. The scope of the journey was daunting, nearly 8,000 miles in total, spanning approximately 2 months if I followed his suggested pace. Could I really undertake such an adventure alone? The Margaret who had existed 4 weeks ago would have dismissed the idea immediately. But now, I went to my bedroom and opened the nightstand drawer where I kept my most precious mementos. Among them was a small notebook where Gerald and I had once listed things we hoped to do in retirement. Opening it now, I found a page titled Places to See Together in my handwriting, followed by a list of destinations, many of which appeared on the road trip itinerary. The Grand Canyon, Redwood National Park, the Rocky Mountains, the Pacific Ocean at sunset. I'd written these wishes decades ago, when retirement seemed a distant dream, and cross-country travel a reasonable ambition for our golden years. Then, life had intervened. Gerald's business struggles in the 90s delaying our retirement savings, my mother's extended illness requiring our care, and finally, Gerald's cancer diagnosis shortly after he'd finally retired. Someday had never come for us together, but Gerald had ensured it could still come for me. My phone rang, interrupting these reflections. It was Andrew. "Mom, Wendy and I have been talking," he began without preamble. "We'd like you to join us for dinner this Sunday. There's something important we want to discuss with you." His tone was unreadable, neither warm nor cold, just determinedly neutral in that way he had perfected in business negotiations. "Of course," I agreed, curious about this formal invitation. "Should I bring anything?" "Just yourself," he replied. "And maybe your road trip plans, if you're comfortable sharing them." After we hung up, I stood at the window overlooking the garden Gerald had meticulously maintained for decades. The rose bushes needed pruning, another task I'd been avoiding since his death, unsure if I could match his careful technique. "I drove on the interstate today," I said aloud to the empty room, imagining Gerald's proud smile. "And I'm thinking about taking that trip you planned. Not sure if I'm ready, but I'm considering it." The silence that answered seemed somehow approving, as if the very walls of our home held Gerald's encouraging presence. I returned to the kitchen table, to the maps and itineraries, and for the first time, I began to make my own notes in the margins. Questions, ideas, small adjustments. Not rewriting Gerald's careful plans, but adding my own voice to our final collaboration. Sunday arrived with a pristine blue sky that reminded me of drives Gerald and I used to take on such perfect days. Aimless journeys down country roads with no destination beyond the pleasure of movement and companionship. I chose to drive myself to Andrew and Wendy's suburban home, a decision that would have seemed impossible just a month ago. Their house was a tastefully updated colonial in an exclusive neighborhood. Impressive but somehow sterile, with landscaping that looked professionally maintained but lacked personal touches. No crooked birdhouse built by a grandfather and grandson on a summer afternoon. No wildflower patch allowed to grow slightly unruly, because the bees preferred it that way. I pulled into their circular driveway, parking my Audi beside Andrew's Mercedes and Wendy's Range Rover. Taking a deep breath, I gathered the folder containing Gerald's road trip plans and my own additions, wondering why Andrew had specifically asked me to bring them. Wendy answered the door with her trademark perfect smile, the one that engaged her mouth but never quite reached her eyes. At 43, my daughter-in-law remained strikingly beautiful, with highlighted blonde hair, an impeccably maintained figure, and clothing that always looked as if it had been selected by a personal stylist, which I reminded myself it probably had been. "Margaret, how lovely to see you," She greeted me with an air kiss near each cheek. And you drove yourself. Andrew mentioned you'd started lessons. Her tone carried that subtle note of condescension she reserved for matters she considered quaint or provincial. My continued residence in the family home, my preference for handwritten notes over texts, and now, apparently, my late-life driving lessons. The Audi handles beautifully, I replied, stepping into their marble-floored entryway. Gerald chose well. A flicker of something, annoyance, discomfort, crossed Wendy's perfect features at the mention of my husband's posthumous gift. Yes, well, Andrew is waiting in the dining room. We've catered from Maurizio's. She led me through their formal living room, a space so carefully curated it could have been a furniture showroom display, into the equally pristine dining room where Andrew stood by a sideboard arranging drinks. "Mom," he greeted me with an awkward half-hug. "Glad you could make it. Scotch and soda?" "Just soda, please," I replied, setting my folder on a corner of the table. "I'm driving, remember?" A hint of genuine pride crossed Andrew's face. "Right. Eleanor mentioned you're making excellent progress." Wendy's eyebrows rose slightly. "You're in regular contact with Margaret's driving instructor?" "I'm overseeing Dad's arrangements," Andrew replied with a shrug that didn't quite achieve the casualness he seemed to be aiming for. Dinner proceeded with the usual polite small talk, their children's achievements at their exclusive private schools, Andrew's recent business successes, Wendy's charity committee work. I had participated in these conversations for years, offering the expected responses and appropriate admiration. Today, however, I found myself strangely detached, as if observing the performance from a distance. When had I become so passive in my relationship with my son and his family? Had it begun when Gerald died, or earlier? Had I surrendered my authentic self in small increments over the years, trading genuine connection for superficial harmony? "Mom?" Andrew's voice broke into my thoughts. "You seem distracted." "I'm sorry," I said, setting down my fork. "I was just thinking about how little we really know each other." The statement, unplanned and unfiltered, landed in the center of the elegant table like an uninvited guest. Wendy's perfect smile froze, while Andrew blinked rapidly, his default response to emotional discomfort. "What a strange thing to say," Wendy laughed lightly. "We've been family for over 20 years. "Yes," I agreed, "and yet I couldn't tell you what truly matters to either of you beyond appearances and achievements. Just as you couldn't tell me what mattered most to Gerald or to me." Andrew set down his wine glass with deliberate care. "Is this about the Mustang? I thought we'd moved past that." "It's not just about the car," I said gently. "It's about seeing each other clearly. Gerald understood that you would sell the Mustang because he understood your values. He didn't share them, but he respected your right to have them. And you think we don't respect yours?" Andrew's tone sharpened defensively. "I think we've never really discussed them," I replied. "We've maintained a polite distance for so long that we've forgotten how to have authentic conversations." Wendy shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Perhaps this isn't the best time." "Actually," Andrew interrupted, "it's exactly the right time." He took a deep breath, exchanging a glance with his wife. "That's partly why we invited you tonight. We've been reconsidering some things." He rose and left the room briefly, returning with a large architectural rendering that he carefully unrolled across the table, weighing the corners with salt and pepper shakers. "This is what we originally planned for your garage," he admitted. The detailed drawing showed my humble garage transformed into an elaborate walk-in closet and dressing room, complete with custom cabinetry, a central island, and specialized storage for shoes, handbags, and seasonal items. "It would have added significant value to the property," Wendy explained, her fingers tracing the elegant design. "The resale potential would have increased substantially." "I see," I said, studying the plans without the anger I might have felt weeks ago. "And now?" Andrew cleared his throat. "After everything that's happened, finding Dad's gift, understanding what he had planned for you, we've had some discussions." He glanced at Wendy, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "We've decided to cancel the renovation plans. It wasn't just about a closet," Wendy added, surprising me with her candor. We assumed you'd be selling the house soon, moving to a retirement community or assisted living. The renovation was part of our preparation for eventually selling the property. The revelation of their assumptions should have hurt, but instead, I found it oddly liberating. At least we were finally speaking truths, however uncomfortable. "And now?" I prompted again. Andrew reached for the folder I'd brought. "Now, we want to know about this road trip Dad planned, the one you're considering taking." I opened the folder, spreading out the maps and itinerary across the table. Gerald spent his final months planning this cross-country journey for me. Every route, every stop, every sight he thought I should experience. Wendy leaned forward, studying the meticulous plans with what appeared to be genuine interest. "This is incredibly detailed. He must have spent hundreds of hours researching." "That was Gerald," I said softly. "Thorough to the end." "And you're actually considering doing this?" Andrew asked, his tone a mixture of disbelief and something that might have been admiration. "Alone? At your age?" In his question, I heard echoes of the practical, safety-conscious voice that had always lived in my own head, the voice that had kept me from many adventures over the decades, the voice Gerald had gently challenged throughout our marriage. "I'm not just considering it," I said, surprising myself with my certainty. "I'm doing it. Eleanor believes I'll be ready for highway travel within another month. I plan to start the journey in early June, when the weather should be ideal across most of the country." Andrew studied me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. "You've changed," he finally said. "Not changed," I corrected him. "Rediscovered parts of myself that have been dormant. Your father always saw those parts, even when I didn't." A silence settled over the table as Andrew and Wendy exchanged another of those married couple glances that contained entire conversations. "We'd like to help," Andrew finally said, "with the trip preparations." Of all the responses I had anticipated, this was perhaps the least expected. "Why?" I asked directly. Andrew looked uncomfortable but continued. "Because I've been thinking about Dad a lot since we found his arrangements for you, about what he valued and what he wanted for both of us." He met my eyes directly. "I want to understand him better, and maybe, by extension, understand you better too." For the first time in years, I saw my son, really saw him, not as the polished, distant businessman he had become, but as the complex individual he was, someone capable of growth and reconsideration, just as Gerald had believed. "I'd like that," I said simply. And as the evening continued, with Andrew and Wendy asking genuine questions about my driving progress and travel plans, I sensed something shifting in our family dynamic, a subtle but significant realignment that Gerald, in his quiet wisdom, might have anticipated all along. 6 weeks after discovering Gerald's hidden gifts, I stood in my driveway at dawn, the Audi packed for a journey I still couldn't quite believe I was undertaking. Eleanor had pronounced me ready after our final lesson the previous day, during which I'd successfully navigated rush-hour interstate traffic with a confidence that surprised us both. "Remember everything we've practiced," she'd said as we parted. "Take frequent breaks, stay in the right lane when you're unsure, and trust your instincts. You're more capable than you realize, Margaret." Now, as I performed one last check of my travel preparations, those words echoed in my mind. The trunk contained a carefully packed suitcase, emergency supplies Gerald had specified in his notes, and a small cooler with provisions for the first day's drive. The passenger seat held my road atlas, despite the GPS. Gerald had insisted on paper maps as backup, the journal he'd left me, and a travel pillow for comfort during long stretches. The morning air felt charged with possibility, the eastern sky just beginning to blush with sunrise. I'd deliberately chosen an early departure to avoid Andrew and Wendy's offer of a proper send-off, which I suspected would only increase my nervousness. Instead, I'd said my goodbyes to them the previous evening, at a surprisingly pleasant dinner, where Andrew had presented me with a new smartphone. For better safety on the road, he'd explained, already programmed with tracking apps that would allow him to monitor my journey from afar. His concern was touching, if somewhat excessive. In the week since our revelatory Sunday dinner, Andrew had thrown himself into my travel preparations with the same methodical thoroughness he applied to business projects. He'd insisted on having the Audi serviced again, purchased an extended roadside assistance package, and even attended my final driving lesson to assess my readiness, a gesture that had amused Eleanor greatly. "Your son has your husband's protective instincts," she'd observed afterward, "but not quite his faith in your capabilities. That will come with time." As I secured the house, checking locks, adjusting thermostats, and setting timers for lights, I felt Gerald's presence strongly, as if he were overseeing my departure with approving attention. In the kitchen, I paused before a framed photograph taken on our 25th anniversary. Gerald and I standing beside a rented convertible during our one real vacation, a week-long drive up the California coast that had remained a cherished memory. "I'm really doing this," I told his smiling image, "just as you planned." Outside again, I took one last look at the house we'd shared for 46 years. The morning light softened its aging features, highlighting the character rather than the wear. Andrew had promised to check on the property regularly during my absence and had even arranged for a gardening service to maintain Gerald's beloved roses, a thoughtful gesture that had moved me deeply. With a deep breath, I slid into the driver's seat, adjusted my mirrors, and started the engine. The first day's route was relatively straightforward: west across Connecticut into New York, then south through Pennsylvania toward my initial overnight stop in Harrisburg. Gerald had planned shorter driving days to begin with, allowing me to build confidence gradually. As I pulled away from the curb, a movement in my rearview mirror caught my attention. A figure stood at the end of my driveway, hand raised in farewell. Andrew. Despite my request for no send-off, he had come anyway, arriving silently in the pre-dawn light to witness this pivotal moment. I slowed, wondering if I should stop, but he shook his head and motioned for me to continue. Understanding his gesture as the respect it was intended to be, I raised my hand in acknowledgement and drove on, watching in my mirror as his figure grew smaller until it disappeared around the corner. The first hour passed in a state of hypervigilance, my hands gripping the wheel tightly as I navigated familiar local roads toward the highway. Every intersection, every merge required conscious thought, but gradually, as the miles accumulated, I felt a subtle shift. My breathing deepened, my shoulders lowered, and driving became less an exercise in concentration and more a fluid, natural activity. By mid-morning, I had crossed into New York State, the Audi's smooth handling and responsive acceleration building my confidence with each passing mile. Traffic increased as I approached more populated areas, but the defensive driving techniques Eleanor had drilled into me now activated automatically, maintaining safe following distances, checking mirrors regularly, anticipating other drivers' movements. At a rest stop just before noon, I called Andrew as promised to report my progress. "You're making excellent time," he said, and I could hear the slight surprise in his voice. "How does it feel?" "Liberating," I answered honestly. I'd forgotten the simple pleasure of movement, of watching the landscape change around you. "Dad would be proud," Andrew said, the words clearly not coming easily to him. "He always believed you could do more than you thought possible." After a brief lunch and a walk to stretch my legs, I continued south, crossing into Pennsylvania in early afternoon. The rolling hills and farmland provided a scenic backdrop as I settled into the rhythm of highway travel. By late afternoon, I had reached Harrisburg and successfully navigated to the small hotel Gerald had selected for my first night. The hotel clerk smiled as I checked in. "Mrs. Thompson, we've been expecting you. Your reservation was made quite some time ago." "Yes," I replied, still amazed by the extent of Gerald's planning. "My husband arranged it." "Well, he chose one of our nicest rooms, Riverview, recently renovated, and this was left for you several months ago." She handed me an envelope with my name written in Gerald's distinctive handwriting. In my room, I sat by the window overlooking the Susquehanna River and opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a simple note card. "My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, you've completed the first day of your journey. I knew you could do it. The first step is always the hardest, whether it's beginning a cross-country drive or starting a new chapter of life. I've arranged small surprises at several stops along your route. Nothing elaborate, just tokens to let you know I'm with you in spirit. The front desk has a package for you in the morning. Tonight, celebrate your courage. Order room service if you're tired. The salmon is excellent here. Or explore the riverfront if you're feeling adventurous. This journey is yours now. I've merely suggested the route. With all my love, Gerald." I pressed the note to my heart, overcome with emotion. Even now, Gerald was guiding me forward while encouraging my independence, the perfect balance he had always maintained in our marriage. After washing away the day's travel dust with a long shower, I surprised myself by choosing exploration over room service. The riverfront was lovely in the evening light, with a walking path that offered views of the water and the city skyline. I found a small restaurant with outdoor seating and enjoyed a leisurely dinner, watching boats move along the river and families stroll the promenade. For the first time in 3 years, I felt truly alive, not just existing in the aftermath of loss, but actively engaging with the world again. The sensation was bittersweet, tinged with awareness of Gerald's absence, but also filled with gratitude for his final gift to me, permission and encouragement to continue living fully. Back in my room, I opened the road trip journal and made my first entry, recording not just the practical details of miles traveled and routes taken, but my thoughts and feelings throughout this momentous day. As Gerald had suggested, the world indeed looked different from the driver's seat. Bigger, more accessible, full of possibilities I had forgotten existed. Day 1 complete, I wrote at the end. I miss you, Gerald, but I feel you with me on this journey. Thank you for believing I could do this, even when I didn't believe it myself. As I drifted toward sleep, I wondered what surprise awaited me in the morning, and what new challenges and discoveries the coming days would bring. The fear that had defined so much of my life had not disappeared entirely, but it had been relegated to a passenger rather than allowed to remain the driver. Tomorrow would bring new roads, new experiences, new tests of my growing confidence. For the first time in decades, I found myself looking forward to the unknown. The package waiting for me at the front desk the next morning contained a small, elegantly wrapped box and another note from Gerald. Inside the box was a vintage compass in a polished brass case, clearly an antique but in perfect working condition. For when you need to find your true north, Gerald's note read. This belonged to my grandfather, who used it to navigate his way across the country during the Great Depression. He taught me that sometimes the most important journeys aren't about reaching a destination, but about discovering what lies within you along the way. Keep it in the glove compartment. Technology fails, but true north remains constant. I fastened the compass to my keychain, comforted by this tangible connection to both Gerald and his family history. After a hearty breakfast, I consulted the day's route, a straight shot west across Pennsylvania toward Pittsburgh, where I would spend my second night before continuing to Columbus, Ohio, the following day. The morning drive was pleasant, traffic light as I left Harrisburg behind and entered the more rural central part of the state. Rolling hills gave way to farmland, punctuated by small towns that appeared and disappeared in my rearview mirror. I was settling into a comfortable cruising rhythm when a dashboard alert suddenly illuminated. Tire pressure warning. My heart rate spiked momentarily, but Eleanor's training kicked in. I carefully reduced speed, checked my mirrors, and pulled onto the shoulder, hazard lights flashing. Once safely stopped, I called the roadside assistance service Andrew had insisted I program into my new phone. Looks like you've picked up a nail, the technician informed me after arriving and inspecting the right rear tire. Not something you'd want to continue driving on, especially for the distances you're planning. I can put on your spare temporarily, but you'll need to get a proper replacement. Can you recommend somewhere nearby? I asked, consulting my GPS. He pointed to a small town about 10 miles ahead. Thornfield has a decent service center, family-owned, been there for decades. They'll treat you right. An hour later, I sat in the waiting area of Thornfield Auto Service, watching as they installed a new tire on my Audi. The delay was frustrating. I'd planned to reach Pittsburgh in time for an early dinner and perhaps some exploration of the city Gerald had marked as having excellent evening river views. Mrs. Thompson? The shop owner, a friendly woman in her 60s named Susan Miller, approached with my paperwork. You're all set. We went ahead and rotated all your tires while we were at it. No extra charge. That's a beautiful vehicle you're driving. Thank you, I replied, rising to complete the payment. My husband chose it. Well, he has excellent taste, she commented, leading me to the counter. You mentioned you're driving cross-country? Yes, I confirmed, feeling a small surge of pride at being able to make this statement. My husband planned the trip before he passed away. I'm following his itinerary. Something in my explanation caught her attention. That's quite something, she said, studying me with newfound interest. You know, if you don't mind a suggestion from a local, there's a scenic route from here that eventually connects back to the highway toward Pittsburgh. Takes maybe an hour longer, but it's one of the prettiest drives in the state. Follows an old railway line through the mountains, past waterfalls, and some historical sites. She pulled out a map and traced the alternative route with her finger. My late husband and I used to drive it every autumn to see the foliage. Always reminded us why we never moved away from Pennsylvania, despite plenty of opportunities. I hesitated. Gerald's carefully planned itinerary weighing against this unexpected suggestion. What would he have wanted me to do? stick rigidly to his plans, or embrace the spontaneous opportunities that travel often presents. The waterfalls sound lovely, I found myself saying, and I'm not in any particular hurry. Susan smiled warmly. That's the right spirit for a journey like yours. Sometimes the best memories come from the unexpected turns. Armed with Susan's hand-drawn map, supplementing my GPS, I set out on the scenic route. Almost immediately, I understood why she had recommended it. The road wound through lush forests and alongside a sparkling creek, occasionally emerging to reveal breathtaking vistas of the valley below. Historical markers dotted the route, telling stories of early settlers, industrial development, and Civil War movements. At Susan's suggestion, I stopped at a particular overlook where a short walking path led to a magnificent waterfall cascading down moss-covered rocks. Standing there, watching the sunlight create rainbows in the mist, I felt an unexpected sense of communion with Gerald. Not the grief-tinged remembrance that had characterized the past 3 years, but something lighter, more joyful, as if we were experiencing this beauty together. I took out my phone, still marveling somewhat at how easily I'd adapted to Andrew's gift, and captured several photos of the falls. On impulse, I sent one to my son with the message, "Unexpected detour." Sometimes the scenic route is worth the extra time. His response came quickly. Beautiful. Dad would approve of spontaneity. By the time I rejoined the main highway, I was nearly 3 hours behind my original schedule. Pittsburgh would have to wait until well after dark. Instead of anxiety, however, I felt a curious liberation. The rigid timekeeping that had governed so much of my adult life, school bells during my teaching career, doctor's appointments during Gerald's illness, the careful routine of widowhood, seemed less important now. I called the Pittsburgh hotel to inform them of my late arrival and continued westward as afternoon faded into evening. Driving in darkness had been one of my greatest concerns, but Eleanor had insisted on night driving practice during our lessons. Now, with the Audi's excellent headlights illuminating the road and its navigation system guiding me confidently, I found the experience not frightening, but peaceful. When I finally reached my hotel, it was past 10 o'clock. Tired but oddly energized, I checked in and discovered another of Gerald's surprises waiting for me. A reservation at the hotel's rooftop restaurant for the following morning's breakfast, timed perfectly to catch what his note described as the most spectacular view of the 3 rivers converging in morning light. In my room, I opened the road trip journal again and recorded the day's events, focusing particularly on the unexpected detour and what it had taught me. Today, I learned that flexibility can be as important as planning, I wrote. The route Gerald mapped is wonderful, but perhaps the greatest gift he gave me was the confidence to occasionally forge my own path. As I prepared for bed, my phone chimed with another message from Andrew. "Tracking shows you arrived safely. How was the drive?" I hesitated, then typed, "Challenging in unexpected ways, beautiful in others." I had a flat tire but handled it. Took a scenic detour on local recommendation. Arrived later than planned, but with no regrets. His response warmed me unexpectedly. "You sound like Dad. He always said the best stories come from the unplanned moments. Sleep well, Mom. Proud of you." Andrew had rarely expressed pride in me. Not because he didn't feel it, perhaps, but because our relationship had settled into different patterns of communication. This simple message, sent across hundreds of miles, felt like another small bridge being rebuilt between us. As I drifted toward sleep, I found myself contemplating the compass Gerald had given me that morning. "True north remains constant," he had written. I was beginning to understand that while grief and loss had temporarily disoriented me, my internal compass was gradually realigning, not to the life I had shared with Gerald, for that was irrevocably changed, but to a new orientation that honored our past while embracing possibilities he had envisioned for me. Tomorrow would bring Pittsburgh's rivers in morning light, then the crossing into Ohio, my first state line as a solo traveler. But tonight, I slept soundly, no longer quite so afraid of the journey or the unknown road ahead. Pittsburgh in morning light was everything Gerald had promised. From the hotel's rooftop restaurant, I watched the sun rise over the confluence of the 3 rivers, the Allegheny and Monongahela, joining to form the Ohio, their waters glinting gold and copper in the early light. Steel bridges spanned the waterways like industrial lace, while the glass towers of downtown reflected the changing sky. I lingered over breakfast, savoring both the view and the recognition that I was in no hurry. This journey was not about checking destinations off a list, but about the experience itself, a lesson I was gradually internalizing after decades of schedule-driven living. As I prepared to depart, the hotel concierge approached with yet another envelope. "This was left for you quite some time ago, Mrs. Thompson," he explained, "with instructions to deliver it this morning." Inside was a small, hand-drawn map of Pittsburgh, with several locations circled in red ink. A note in Gerald's handwriting explained, "These were my favorite spots during business trips to the Steel City. The point is magnificent, but don't miss the Duquesne Incline for the best view of the city. If you have time, the Carnegie Museums are worth a few hours." I studied the map, then made a spontaneous decision. The carefully planned itinerary had me leaving Pittsburgh immediately after breakfast, reaching Columbus by mid-afternoon. But why rush? This journey was mine to shape, and Gerald's suggestions beckoned enticingly. I approached the concierge again. "I'd like to extend my stay for another night, if possible." "Of course, Mrs. Thompson. Your husband actually reserved the room for 2 nights originally, with a note that you might decide to stay longer." His smile suggested this wasn't the first of Gerald's arrangements he had facilitated. The revelation that Gerald had anticipated my potential desire for flexibility touched me deeply. He had known me so well, not just the cautious, schedule-oriented woman I had been for most of our marriage, but the more adventurous spirit he had always believed existed beneath my careful exterior. I spent the day exploring Pittsburgh through Gerald's eyes, visiting each location he had marked. At the point where the rivers converged, I sat on a bench watching boats navigate the currents while children played in the nearby fountain. The Duquesne Incline, a century-old cable car that climbed Mount Washington, provided breathtaking panoramic views of the city spread below. And the Carnegie Museums occupied my afternoon with treasures of art and natural history. At each stop, I found myself imagining Gerald there, his observations, his appreciation for both engineering marvels and natural beauty. It felt less like following a guidebook and more like sharing experiences across the boundary that separated us. That evening, I called Andrew to update him on my change of plans. "You're staying an extra day?" he asked, surprise evident in his voice. "What about the itinerary?" "The itinerary is a suggestion, not a mandate," I replied, surprising myself with the confidence in my tone. "Your father planned this journey as a gift, not an assignment. I'm discovering that sometimes it feels right to linger." A pause, then. "That makes sense. Dad was never rigid about plans. That was always more—" He trailed off. "More my tendency," I finished for him. "Yes, I know. I'm learning to be more flexible." "It suits you," he said quietly. "Wendy mentioned that your texts sound different, more present," she said. The observation startled me. I hadn't realized my written communications reflected the internal changes I was experiencing. "Present is a good word for it," I acknowledged. "For years after your father died, I think I was just existing, not really living. This journey is changing that." After our call, I found myself reflecting on boundaries, not just the state lines I was crossing on this journey, but the less tangible ones I had imposed on myself throughout life. Boundaries between safety and risk, between routine and adventure, between the woman I had been with Gerald and the woman I might become without him. The next morning, I resumed my westward journey, crossing into Ohio around noon. The state welcome sign prompted an unexpected surge of emotion. A sense of accomplishment mingled with excitement. I pulled into the welcome center and asked a fellow traveler to take my photograph beside the "Welcome to Ohio" sign, sending it immediately to Andrew with the caption, "State number 2 conquered." His response made me laugh out loud. "Only 46 more to go? Kidding, unless you're planning to hit Alaska and Hawaii on this trip too." The playful text revealed yet another boundary being crossed. The formal, somewhat distant relationship between Andrew and me gradually yielding to something warmer, more genuine. Columbus provided another surprise, though not one Gerald had arranged. As I checked into my hotel, a historic property downtown that Gerald had selected for its architectural significance, the desk clerk handed me my key with a curious expression. "You're Margaret Thompson. We have a message for you." She passed me an envelope, not Gerald's handwriting this time, but Andrew's precise script. Inside was a gift certificate to a nearby spa with a note. "Wendy suggested you might enjoy some pampering after several days on the road. The hotel concierge can arrange transportation if you don't feel like driving. Call when you get this. Andrew. Touched by this thoughtful gesture, I called my son immediately. How did you know where to send it? I asked after thanking him. Dad's itinerary, he explained. I've been reviewing it, trying to understand his thinking better. The Columbus hotel reservation stood out because he'd written a special note about its historic architecture. Thought you might appreciate something relaxing after all that driving? It's perfect, I assured him. But I'm curious. Why the sudden interest in understanding your father's planning? A long pause followed before Andrew replied, his voice unusually hesitant. I've been reading his journal, the one about the Mustang restoration that you shared with me. There's more of him in those pages than I expected. More depth, more consideration for details most people would overlook. That was Gerald, I said softly, always noticing the things others missed, including things about me, Andrew continued, his voice tightening slightly. There are entries where he talks about my visits, observations about my career choices, my marriage. He saw things I never realized he noticed. The vulnerability in my son's voice moved me deeply. Your father was immensely proud of you, I told him, even when he didn't fully understand your choices. I know that now, Andrew replied, but I'm realizing how little I knew him, really knew him, beyond the surface role of dad. His insight struck a chord. How many of us truly know our parents as complete human beings, with dreams, fears, and inner lives separate from their parental roles? And how many parents allow themselves to be fully known? Perhaps that's something we could work on together, I suggested. Getting to know Gerald better, even now. And in the process, maybe understanding ourselves more clearly too. I'd like that, Andrew said, with a warmth that reminded me suddenly, painfully, of his father. After our call, I took full advantage of the spa gift certificate, luxuriating in treatments that eased the physical tension of days behind the wheel. As I relaxed into a massage, I found myself contemplating the evolving nature of my relationship with Andrew, another unexpected gift emerging from this journey. That evening, exploring Columbus on foot, I came across a small bookstore cafe with a sign advertising an author reading. On impulse, I stepped inside, finding a cozy space filled with an eclectic mix of people. The featured author was discussing her memoir about rebuilding her life after losing her partner of 30 years. I found a seat in the back, ordered tea, and listened as she read passages describing her struggle to redefine herself in the absence of the person who had been her anchor for most of adult life. Her words resonated powerfully, articulating feelings I had experienced but never fully expressed. During the question period, I surprised myself by raising my hand. When called upon, I heard myself asking, "How did you know when you were ready to create a new life rather than just surviving the loss of your old one?" The author smiled gently. I don't think we ever know in any definitive way. But for me, the moment of transition came when I realized I was making choices based on what might bring me joy in the present, rather than what would cause the least pain or disruption to memories of the past. Her answer stayed with me as I walked back to my hotel through streets alive with the evening energy of a vibrant city. Was that what I was doing now? Making choices based on potential joy rather than minimal pain? The very fact that I was contemplating such questions felt significant. Another boundary crossed between mere existence and authentic living. In my hotel room, I opened the road trip journal and made a longer entry than usual, reflecting not just on the day's experiences, but on the internal journey that was unfolding alongside the physical one. I am crossing state lines and personal boundaries daily now, I wrote. Each mile seems to create more distance, not just from home, but from the limited version of myself I accepted for too long. Gerald knew this would happen. Somehow he knew that physical movement would catalyze emotional and psychological momentum as well. As I closed the journal, my phone chimed with a text from an unknown number. Opening it, I found a photograph of the Mustang gleaming under professional lighting in what appeared to be a private collection showroom. The message read, "Mrs. Thompson, Carlos Mendoza gave me your number. Thought you might like to see that your husband's masterpiece has found a good home. You're welcome to visit any time. Richard Bennett." I studied the image, expecting to feel a renewed sense of loss. Instead, I found myself appreciating the beauty of Gerald's work and feeling grateful that it was being valued by someone who understood its significance. Another boundary crossed, from possession to appreciation, from loss to gratitude. Tomorrow would bring more miles, more state lines, more discoveries. But tonight, in a historic hotel in Columbus, Ohio, I felt myself becoming someone new while simultaneously reconnecting with parts of myself long forgotten. A paradox Gerald might have appreciated and perhaps had even anticipated when planning this journey of rediscovery. 4 weeks and nearly 5,000 miles into my cross-country journey, I stood at the edge of the Grand Canyon as sunset painted the stratified rocks in shades of amber, crimson, and gold. Gerald's itinerary had timed our arrival perfectly. The canyon at sunset was indeed, as his notes had promised, something everyone should see once in their lifetime. Our arrival. In my mind, Gerald had become my traveling companion, his presence felt in every carefully planned detail, and in the spaces between them where I'd made my own choices. His voice seemed to whisper in the stunning vistas he'd selected, in the quirky roadside attractions he'd marked with asterisks in his notes, definitely worth a short detour, and in the quiet moments of reflection his journey had built into my days. I was not the same woman who had stood frozen in an empty garage 6 weeks earlier. That Margaret had been defined by caution and routine, by grief's comfortable boundaries. This Margaret, tanned from afternoons exploring national parks, confident behind the wheel on mountain roads and city highways alike, capable of striking up conversations with strangers in diners and visitor centers, was someone both new and strangely familiar, as if I'd rediscovered a self that had been hibernating. My phone rang, interrupting my contemplation of the vast chasm before me. Andrew's name appeared on the screen. "I just watched the sunset at the Grand Canyon," I told him without preamble. "I know," he replied, surprising me. "Your location updated on the tracking app. How is it?" "Indescribable," I said truthfully. "Photos don't do it justice. The depth, the colors, the sheer scale of it. It makes you feel simultaneously insignificant and profoundly alive." "Dad always wanted to see it," Andrew said quietly. "It was on his bucket list." "Mine too," I acknowledged. We kept saying someday until someday ran out. A comfortable silence stretched between us, the kind that had rarely existed in our relationship before this journey. "Actually, that's partly why I'm calling," Andrew finally continued. "Wendy and I have been talking. We'd like to join you for the last week of your trip, meet you in San Francisco, and drive the Pacific Coast Highway portion together. If that wouldn't disrupt your experience too much." The request stunned me. Andrew taking time away from his demanding career? Wendy willingly embarking on a road trip rather than a luxury resort vacation? This was unprecedented. "I'd love that," I said, meaning it. "Your father would too. He always hoped we might travel together as a family someday." "Well, someday is apparently now," Andrew replied, echoing my earlier words with an audible smile. "We've booked flights for next Wednesday. I've been studying Dad's route for the coastal portion. It looks spectacular." After we ended the call, I remained at the canyon rim as twilight deepened into night and stars appeared in impossible profusion above the dark chasm. Gerald had noted this too. Stay after sunset for the stars. No city lights to diminish them, like looking into eternity. The next morning brought a call from an unexpected source, Richard Bennett, the collector who had purchased the Mustang. "Mrs. Thompson," his warm voice greeted me. "I hope I'm not intruding. Carlos mentioned you were on a cross-country journey, and I've been following your progress through the photos you've sent him." I had indeed been sharing occasional images with Carlos, who had become something of a long-distance cheerleader for my adventure. "Not intruding at all, Mr. Bennett," I assured him. "How is the Mustang?" "Magnificent. It's the centerpiece of my collection now. Your husband's craftsmanship was extraordinary." He paused briefly. "Actually, I'm calling because I'm hosting a classic car exhibition at my home in Monterey next month. The Mustang will be featured prominently, and I wondered if you might consider attending as my guest of honor. I'd love to have you speak about Gerald's restoration process." Monterey was on my coastal route, one of the final stops before San Francisco. The timing would be perfect. "I'd be honored," I replied, surprised by how right it felt. Gerald would have loved knowing his work was being appreciated by fellow enthusiasts. "Wonderful. I'll have my assistant send you the details." Another pause. "And Mrs. Thompson? Carlos told me about the journey your husband planned for you. I lost my wife 5 years ago, so I understand something of the path you're walking. It's inspiring to see how you're honoring your husband's final gift, The conversation left me contemplative as I continued my westward journey. Over the following days, as I crossed the Mojave Desert into California, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected connections this trip had fostered, with strangers who became momentary friends, with my increasingly supportive son, with the memory of Gerald transformed from a source of pain to a wellspring of strength. By the time Andrew and Wendy joined me in San Francisco, I had traversed mountains and deserts, navigated bustling cities and sleepy towns, and discovered a resilience I had forgotten I possessed. The woman who greeted them at the airport bore little resemblance to the shell-shocked widow who had stood in an empty garage 7 weeks earlier. "Mom, you look—" Andrew seemed at a loss for words as he embraced me. "Alive," Wendy supplied, studying me with genuine warmth. "You look alive." The coastal drive with Andrew and Wendy proved to be the perfect conclusion to my journey. To my surprise, they adapted easily to the unhurried pace I had embraced, stopping for impromptu explorations of beaches and viewpoints, lingering over meals in seaside restaurants Gerald had marked in his notes, and engaging in conversations deeper than any we had shared in years. One evening, as we watched the sunset from a cliffside restaurant in Big Sur, Andrew raised his wineglass in a toast. "To Dad," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for giving us all a second chance." "To Gerald," I echoed, clinking my glass against his, who saw possibilities where others saw endings. On our final day, we detoured to Monterey for Richard Bennett's exhibition. The Mustang gleamed under perfect lighting, surrounded by appreciative enthusiasts who listened raptly as I shared stories of Gerald's painstaking restoration process. The car that had once been a source of such grief had transformed into a conduit for connection and remembrance, another of Gerald's carefully orchestrated gifts. As we completed the final miles of my journey, returning to the same Connecticut driveway where it had begun nearly 2 months earlier, I felt a curious mixture of completion and anticipation. This particular circle was closing, but others were opening before me. Andrew helped carry my luggage inside, while Wendy exclaimed over the garden, which the service had maintained beautifully in my absence. "Will you stay the night?" I asked them, suddenly reluctant to be alone in the house that had been empty for so long. "Actually," Andrew exchanged glances with his wife, "we were hoping to stay the weekend if that's all right. There's something we'd like to discuss with you." Over dinner, prepared together in the kitchen where Gerald had once flipped Sunday pancakes with flourish, they shared their proposal. "We've been thinking," Andrew began cautiously, "about your house. This house." I tensed slightly, remembering their earlier assumptions about my selling and moving to assisted living. "Not about you selling it," he quickly clarified, reading my expression. "About us spending more time here, with you." "Our children barely know this place or the town where their father grew up," Wendy added, "and they've missed out on really knowing you. We thought perhaps regular weekend visits, school holidays, if you'd welcome that kind of presence in your life." The offer brought tears to my eyes. Another boundary crossed, another circle completing itself. "I would welcome that very much," I said simply. Later that night, after Andrew and Wendy had retired to the guest room, I stood in the garage beside my Audi, now dusty from thousands of miles of American roads. The space no longer felt empty without the Mustang. Instead, it seemed full of possibility, a launching point rather than a void. On an impulse, I opened the road trip journal and added a final entry. "Gerald, I've completed the journey you planned, not exactly as you mapped it, but in the spirit you intended. I've crossed state lines and personal boundaries. I've seen sunsets and sunrises from places I never imagined I would visit. I've reconnected with our son and discovered strengths within myself I had forgotten existed. But the greatest discovery has been that endings can contain beginnings. The empty garage that started this journey wasn't really empty at all. It was filled with the space necessary for something new to emerge. You knew this, of course. You always saw the road ahead more clearly than I did. I still miss you every day. I suspect I always will. But missing you no longer means being afraid to move forward. The compass you gave me points true north, and I'm no longer afraid to follow where it leads. Thank you for my final driving lesson, my love, teaching me how to navigate life without you while carrying you always in my heart." I closed the journal and placed it on the small shelf beside Gerald's model Mustang. 2 tangible reminders of a love that had transcended loss and a journey that had transformed grief into gratitude. Tomorrow would bring new roads to explore, new choices to make. But tonight, in the quiet of a house filled once more with family, I felt Gerald's presence not as a ghost of the past, but as a light illuminating the way forward. The circle was complete. And in its completion, a spiral had begun, carrying me onward into whatever adventures awaited an aging woman who had discovered at 71 that bravery was still possible and that life could offer new beginnings even after the most painful endings.